Hello and welcome back to the Sci-Fi Stories channel. My dear listeners, unfortunately, YouTube has completely disabled our monetization features, leaving us without the budget to keep this channel alive. If you enjoy today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our hardworking team to survive and continue creating these worlds for you. You can easily do this by scanning the QR code on your screen, or by clicking the donation link in the video description or the pinned comment below. The silence aboard the ecological seeding vessel, Demeter, was absolute, unbroken, except for the ragged, wet rasp of a failing human lung. Billy Baxter dragged his radiation-scarred body into the main corridor, only to freeze. His 14 crewmates were not dead, nor were they missing. They stood frozen in mid-step, transformed entirely into flawless, transparent biological crystal, their faces locked in terrifyingly perfect, eternal smiles. The primary engine core of the massive ship was completely dead. Not a single hum of the warp drive vibrated through the cold floorboards. Only the faint, rhythmic clicking of the emergency life support cycler echoed in the pitch-black hallways, serving as a mechanical metronome for the absolute nightmare unfolding around Billy. He leaned heavily against the steel bulkhead, clutching his chest as a familiar spasm of pain shot through his fibrotic lungs. Every breath felt like inhaling broken glass, a stark contrast to the smooth, silent death that had claimed his friends. He stumbled further down the long corridor toward the medical bay, his handheld flashlight beam cutting through the oppressive, heavy darkness. The beam of light caught the refracted gleam of 14 magnificent sculptures standing in the hall. They were breathtakingly beautiful. They were also his colleagues. Captain Eris stood with her hand outstretched toward a wall console, her entire biological makeup transmuted into a flawless, glass-like substance. Not a single drop of blood stained the pristine white floor. Every vein, every muscle fiber, every internal organ had been crystallized into absolute, mathematical perfection. And on every single face, a serene, symmetrical smile was permanently etched into the rigid crystal. Billy wiped a bead of cold sweat from his deeply scarred forehead. His heavily calloused fingers traced the raised, ugly burns that covered the entire left side of his face and neck. The sheer horror of the situation crystallized in his mind as he looked past the glowing statues and saw the open doors of the automated medical pods. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the stomach. The crew had just undergone their routine cellular purging, a mandatory company protocol designed to eliminate any microscopic genetic defects and achieve optimal health. They had been perfected, and that very perfection had been their exact undoing. For 5 long years, Billy had been the sole dissenter on the Demeter. He was a veteran bioengineer who understood the intricate mechanics of life better than anyone on board. Yet he outright refused to step inside those gleaming white healing machines. He stubbornly clung to his ruined lungs, his erratic heartbeat, and his hideous radiation scars. They were a bitter inheritance from a catastrophic reactor meltdown he had barely survived decades ago. Those scars were his personal penance, a tangible, painful reminder of human error and the heavy cost of survival. The crew had always pitied him for carrying such an ugly burden when a simple 30-minute cycle in the medical pod could wipe it all away. Now, looking at their flawless, unmoving glass eyes, catching the light of his torch, Billy realized his stubborn embrace of his own brokenness was the sole reason his heart was still beating. He limped toward the passive sensor array terminal in the auxiliary control room, his boots thudding loudly in the dead quiet. The main digital screens were entirely dark, but the analog backup monitors flickered to life under his trembling hands. The raw data streaming across the green phosphor screen made his already labored breathing hitch in his throat. Out there, in the unfathomable void of deep space, something was moving, It was completely invisible to the ship's standard optical scanners, yet, undeniably, terrifyingly massive. The passive sensors recorded a gravitational wake so enormous it distorted the ancient starlight across 3 neighboring star systems. But it was the wake it left behind that chilled Billy to his very marrow. Planets, worlds once teeming with wild, chaotic biomes and sprawling oceans, now registered purely as dead zones. But they were not simply destroyed by weapons or fire. The atmospheric and topographical scans of the nearest ravaged world showed its entire surface had been forcibly, painstakingly rearranged. Towering mountains, deep oceans, and sprawling continents had been leveled and reconstructed into absolutely perfect, symmetrical geometric blocks. It was as if an obsessive, unfathomable God had swept through the cosmos, entirely erasing the messy, unpredictable nature of organic existence and replacing it with cold, static flawlessness. The Demeter was trapped in the invisible slipstream of this cosmic entity, completely adrift in the freezing dark. Billy sat heavily in the captain's chair, the plush leather groaning under his weight. The oppressive silence of the giant ship pressed against his eardrums, a heavy physical weight, broken only by his own ragged, uneven breathing. A deep, agonizing tickle built up deep within his chest. He bent forward, hacking violently into the darkness, the sound loud and pathetic against the silence of the perfected dead. When the coughing fit finally passed, he wiped his mouth with the back of his trembling hand. Even in the dim, red glow of the emergency lighting, the thick smear of dark blood was unmistakable. He wiped the blood on his stained gray jumpsuit and stared at the dark stain. Day 1, he thought to himself. He would not count the passage of time by the ship's dead chronometers. He would measure his survival by the agonizing spasms of his own failing body, by every single drop of blood he coughed up into the sterile air. In this vast, terrifying universe, where an unimaginable entity roamed to extinguish anything that dared to reach a state of physical perfection. Billy Baxter sat completely alone in the dark. He listened to the wet, broken rhythm of his own lungs, understanding with terrifying clarity that his fragile, diseased, and beautifully flawed existence was the only thing pathetic enough to be ignored by the Reaper of the cosmos. For 40 agonizing days, Billy transformed the dead auxiliary control room into a frantic workshop of tangled wires and scavenged motherboards. Time blurred into a manic, desperate obsession. He cannibalized the frozen primary systems, tearing out intact data cores with his bare, heavily calloused hands. His singular objective was to rebuild the corrupted sensor logs from the exact microsecond his crewmates underwent their horrific transmutation. He spliced power lines directly from the emergency life support cycler, risking his own dwindling air supply to feed enough raw voltage into the makeshift decryptor. The analog screens finally flared to life, vomiting cascading lines of raw hexadecimal code that illuminated the darkness. He scoured the data for energy spikes, expecting to find the signature of a hostile dreadnought. He found no traces of plasma cannons, no nuclear warheads, and no kinetic bombardments. There was no warlike conqueror lurking in the void. The decryption matrix compiled the anomaly into a terrifyingly pristine, massive structural map. It was an entity he categorized as the Symmetry Swarm. It was not a conventional ship piloted by living beings. It was an autonomous, cosmic restructuring algorithm made entirely physical, executing a cold, ancient prime directive to eliminate the chaotic, unpredictable variables of natural evolution across the universe. The data stream accelerated exponentially, forcing Billy to read at a breathless, frantic pace. His eyes darted across the monitors as the true purpose of the entity unfolded. The swarm did not eradicate life blindly in a crusade of death. The second revelation struck him with the agonizing force of a physical blow. The swarm attacked perfection. It actively hunted down advanced civilizations that had managed to conquer their own mortality. It sought out species that had reached the absolute zenith of genetic engineering. Those beings who had painstakingly rewritten their own cellular makeup to be perfectly symmetrical, immune to all known diseases, and completely devoid of any organic flaws. The entity viewed biological messiness as a mathematical error desperately needing correction. Once a species achieved this ultimate biological superiority, the unfeeling logic of the swarm reclassified them. They were no longer considered independent, thriving life forms. They were flagged by the system as material ready for harvest. The entity would then cast its invisible, vast energy net, instantly crystallizing every individual to preserve their flawless state forever, neatly cataloging them into an eternal, static collection of galactic museum pieces. Panic, cold and sharp as a scalpel, drove Billy toward the diplomatic database of the ship. His breathing grew shallow and rapid as his scarred fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard, punching in top-secret access codes for the interstellar communications network. He bypassed the damaged local arrays and tapped directly into the long-range subspace receiver, frantically searching for the beacon frequencies of the closest extraterrestrial allies of humanity. He searched for the Luminary, the Kalan, the Vorax, and 3 other distinct alien species renowned across the known galaxy for their immaculate, genetically purified bodies. The search queries returned one after another, echoing back from the dead void. Signal lost. Connection timed out. Blanket silence. He expanded the search parameters, stretching the historical timeline back through the heavily encrypted archives. The horrifying truth materialized on the glowing green monitors. Every single one of those 6 allied races had gone completely dark over the past 2 centuries. Entire spanning empires of flawless, immortal beings had been quietly, systematically harvested while humanity, constantly busy squabbling over its own messy, flawed existence, had not even noticed their absence. A blinking, subroutine hidden beneath layers of noise caught his frantic eye. It was an anomalous fragment of alien telemetry, embedded deep within the vast wake signature of the swarm, dating back to a forgotten initial scouting pass. Billy ran the translation matrix, intentionally burning out 2 processor nodes to force the decryption process through. The timestamp attached to the file was staggering. It recorded a specific moment millions of years ago when a tiny, exploratory tendril of the swarm had brushed past a young, highly volatile planet called Earth. The translation finally compiled into a single, devastatingly blunt assessment report logged by the unfathomable cosmic machine. Garbage data, continuously decaying biological structure, self-destructing and self-replicating, unindexable. Billy stared blankly at the screen, the pale light washing over his heavily scarred, asymmetrical face. The swarm had looked down at the primordial soup of Earth, at the violent, messy, and agonizing process of natural selection, at the completely random mutations and the constant, ugly cycle of decay and rebirth, and it had been thoroughly disgusted. To an entity programmed to collect perfect geometric and genetic harmony, humanity was a gross anomaly. Our incurable diseases, our relentless and painful aging process, our chaotic genetic drift, and our entirely asymmetrical bodies were completely abhorrent to the pristine algorithms of the swarm. We were nothing but biological waste. We were the trash of the cosmos, utterly unworthy of being harvested into its crystal collection. The sheer cosmic irony forced a harsh, jagged laugh from his ruined lungs. Humanity had survived the silent end of the galaxy, not because we were strong, nor because we were technologically advanced. We survived because we were simply too ugly to be noticed. A harsh, jagged sound suddenly shattered the absolute quiet of the auxiliary control center. It started as a low, rumbling chuckle deep within his ruined chest, rattling painfully against his ribs before erupting into a full, maniacal roar of laughter. Billy threw his head back and laughed until tears streamed down his scarred cheeks and his throat burned with the sharp taste of copper. It was the unrestrained, defiant joy of a condemned man who had just discovered the fatal flaw of his executioner. He, a battered, wheezing relic of industrial accidents and genetic misfortune, was actively mocking a cosmic deity of immaculate order. The grand irony was a potent adrenaline shot straight to his failing heart. He was entirely done hiding in the shadows. He refused to cower in the dark, waiting for the algorithmic reaper to inevitably circle back and notice the single anomalous blip on its flawless radar. If this entity despised chaos, he would serve it a towering masterpiece of disorder. Billy hauled himself out of the heavy leather chair with a newfound, ferocious energy. He marched down to the primary engineering deck, violently prying open the pristine maintenance panels with a heavy titanium crowbar. Instead of initiating the standard repair protocols to smooth out the energy flow, he began intentionally rerouting the main power conduits. He deliberately crossed the positive and negative phase aligners, splicing delicate optical cables directly into the heavy-duty plasma lines. The massive ship immediately protested. Alarm klaxons wailed in discordant, screeching pitches. The artificial gravity plating beneath his boots flickered wildly, creating sudden, nauseating pockets of heavy pressure and absolute weightlessness. Emergency lights strobed erratically, casting wild, dancing shadows across the steel bulkheads. By purposely miswiring the core processors, Billy was generating massive, completely unstable electromagnetic pulses. The Demeter was no longer a pinnacle of high-tech human engineering, gliding smoothly through the void. He was transforming the vessel into the mechanical equivalent of a feverish, seizing patient. It was sick. It was incredibly noisy, and it was magnificently chaotic. But a malfunctioning ship was simply not enough to secure his survival. He desperately needed biological anarchy. Dragging his heavy toolkit behind him, Billy forced his way through the reinforced blast doors of the terraforming bay. This massive, vaulted chamber was the beating heart of the seeding mission, housing millions of dormant plant seeds and microbial cultures perfectly engineered to breathe life into sterile exoplanets. Under normal operations, these delicate samples were cultivated in utterly sterile, climate-controlled incubation tubes to ensure 100% genetic purity and predictable growth patterns. Billy walked down the endless rows of glowing green vials and flashed a grim, predatory smile. He bypassed the strict environmental safeguards and manually disengaged the heavy lead shields, protecting the cultivation racks from the damaged reactor of the ship. Then, he grabbed a heavy wrench and completely cracked open the primary exhaust valves. Instead of pure, perfectly filtered nutrient mists, he pumped raw, unfiltered gamma radiation directly from the leaking engine core straight into the delicate incubation chambers. The results were instantaneous and absolutely grotesque. Without the complex radiation filters to maintain structural stability, the forced cellular division spiraled entirely out of control. Inside the reinforced glass tubes, perfectly designed algae strains aggressively mutated into sludgy, pulsating masses of violent violet and sickly yellow. Symmetrical fern spores violently expanded, tearing through their own cellular walls to sprout jagged, mismatched thorns and cancerous, bulbous growths. They were living, dying, and rotting simultaneously, trapped in a hyper-accelerated cycle of glorious, terrifying biological anarchy. The entire bay rapidly morphed into a humid, foul-smelling jungle of rapid evolution and immediate decay. It was the absolute, messy antithesis of the cold, static crystal museum the cosmic entity desired. Thick sweat poured down his heavily scarred face, stinging his eyes as he dragged a sophisticated vital signs monitor from the ruined medical wing all the way into the main communications relay room. He ripped open his stained gray jumpsuit and slapped the cold, adhesive sensor pads directly onto his ruined chest. He did not use the machine to heal his broken body. He used it to weaponize his sickness. He routed his own biological telemetry directly into the deep space wideband transmitter array. "Let us see how your flawless algorithms process this," Billy whispered hoarsely to the empty, flashing room. He slammed his fist onto the primary transmit switch, out into the freezing, sterile vacuum of deep space. The Demeter began to scream. It was not a message of peace, nor was it a standard distress signal. It was a deafening, broadband blast of pure, unadulterated organic imperfection. Billy broadcasted the erratic, skipping thud of his damaged heart across dozens of frequencies. He transmitted the jagged, unpredictable audio waves of his own wet, hacking coughs. He sent the chaotic, violently messy data maps of his struggling immune system, fiercely battling the chronic pneumonia flaring in his damaged lungs. He cranked the signal amplifier to maximum capacity, projecting his pain, his sickness, and his stubborn, aggressively ugly will to live across millions of miles of empty space. It was a towering, defiant beacon of trash, challenging the silent architect of the cosmos to look upon the absolute worst humanity had to offer. The proximity alarms shrieked a new, desperate pitch. On the massive navigational hololith, the dark void shifted. It was an eclipse on a cosmic scale. The sheer geometric mass of the symmetry swarm, previously drifting away toward distant star clusters, was now slowly, deliberately rotating on its axis. It blotted out an entire constellation of stars as its monolithic structures realigned. The bait had worked perfectly. The towering, abhorrent beacon of disease, genetic mutation, and biological chaos that Billy was blasting into the void had violently snagged the attention of the ultimate perfectionist. The algorithmic god was turning around to clean up the horrifying mess. The tactical computer calculated the trajectory and acceleration of the returning Leviathan. Billy had exactly 72 hours before the massive entity would overtake the Demeter and vaporize the source of the horrific noise. He had exactly 72 hours to turn the overflowing, hyper-mutating terraforming bay into a localized weapon of mass biological disruption. He needed to physically detach the entire atmospheric containment module and rig it directly to the primary mass driver, essentially creating a colossal, dirty bomb made of rampant, cancerous life. But the main cargo elevator was permanently fused shut from his earlier electrical sabotage. The only available route down to the lower launch bay was through the primary ventilation shafts, which were now entirely flooded with corrosive coolant gas leaking from the severely strained thermal regulators. Billy squeezed his battered, exhausted body into the narrow, claustrophobic duct. Toxic, icy condensation dripped onto his radiation scars, stinging the damaged tissue like a swarm of angry hornets. He dragged his heavy tool harness with him by a thick strap clamped between his teeth, inching forward in agonizingly slow, painful increments. Halfway down the steep vertical drop, a sudden, violent gravitational tremor rocked the entire ship as the swarm's massive energy wake hit them. The metal groaned under the sheer stress, and a heavy, magnetized air baffle slammed shut directly on his left hand. The wet crunch of bone echoed sickeningly in the confined metal tube. Billy screamed, a raw, primal sound of absolute agony that tore at his ruined, coughing throat. He yanked his arm backward with all his remaining strength, but his fingers were completely trapped. The fragile tissue and bone instantly crushed beneath the immense weight of the steel plate. He was securely pinned inside a toxic pipe, and the cosmic clock was mercilessly ticking down. Reaching into his utility belt with his trembling right hand, he pulled out a jagged, plasma-heated laser scalpel. He had heavy medical anesthetics in his survival kit, but he aggressively kicked the pouch down the dark shaft. He absolutely needed the sheer, blinding agony. He needed his central nervous system screaming, flooded with extreme adrenaline, to keep his exhausted mind awake and hyper-focused. Gritting his teeth until he tasted fresh, warm blood, he pressed the glowing, burning blade directly against his trapped, necrotic digit. The nauseating smell of his own vaporizing flesh mixed with the toxic coolant gas, making him gag violently in the cramped space. He forcefully sliced through the crushed cartilage and severed the screaming nerve endings without a single moment of hesitation. When he finally pulled his mutilated, bleeding hand free, he wrapped it tightly in a greasy strip of cloth torn from his jumpsuit. The explosive, continuous waves of pain radiating up his forearm acted like a brutal, highly effective stimulant, sharpening his blurry vision and driving away the suffocating wave of exhaustion. He kicked the lower shaft grate open with his heavy boot and tumbled out onto the launch bay, leaving a gruesome trail of bloody handprints on the pristine, white floor plates. Working with one functional hand, he frantically wired the volatile containment module of the terraforming bay directly to the magnetic catapult of the ship. It was a crude, incredibly ugly mechanical marriage. He ruthlessly bypassed every single safety protocol, forcing the heavy launch rails to accept a massive, unstable payload they were never designed to carry. The colossal tank of violently mutating biomass groaned under the immense magnetic pressure, threatening to burst open and flood the ship. Just as he engaged the final, heavy locking clamps, a completely new proximity klaxon blared through the massive bay, shaking the deck plates. Billy dragged himself to the nearest diagnostic terminal, wiping sweat and blood from his eyes, fully expecting to see the swarm preparing its final firing sequence to wipe him out. Instead, the short-range radar screen exploded with sudden, massive thermal blooms. They were warp signatures, violently tearing large, jagged holes in the fabric of space-time directly behind the looming geometric mass of the swarm. For a terrifying, breathless second, Billy thought the entity had summoned a secondary armada of exterminators to finish the job. But the optical scanners quickly brought the massive anomaly into sharp, depressing focus. It was not a majestic, highly advanced armada of perfect beings. It was a gargantuan fleet of absolute scrap. Dozens of massive, battered vessels tumbled violently out of warp space, venting plasma and trailing debris. They were patchwork ships, frantically cobbled together from the shattered, burned-out hulls of vastly different alien architectures. A propulsion ring from a sleek dreadnought was hastily welded to the bulky crew decks of a slow transport, held together by sheer luck and thick magnetic tethers. It was a desperate, fleeing caravan of interstellar refugees, limping blindly through the dark directly into the kill zone. The broad-spectrum radio panel hissed loudly, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of static interference generated by the approaching swarm. Then, forcefully punching through the heavy, crackling noise, a loud voice echoed through the bridge speakers of the Demeter. It was not a smoothly digitized, perfect alien translation. It was rough, distinctly human, and heavily laced with absolute panic. It came transmitting directly from the lead patchwork dreadnought of the junkyard fleet. "Demeter vessel, shut off that garbage broadcaster immediately." The human voice roared over the crackling communications channel. "You are calling death down upon us." But the desperate warning came far too late. The sudden, chaotic arrival of the refugee fleet had triggered the final, aggressive escalation of the entity. Out in the freezing, silent void, the massive geometric blocks of the symmetry swarm began to shift, rotate, and separate with terrifying, calculated speed. It was rapidly accelerating, drawing massive amounts of power from the surrounding starfields. Between its monolithic, perfectly angled pylons, a blinding, crystalline web of highly destructive energy began to charge. The vast net of total transmutation was fully primed, preparing to sweep forward and permanently freeze both Billy's chaotic ship and the newly arrived, desperate survivors into an eternal, flawless collection of glass. A deafening crash reverberated through the damaged hull of the Demeter, throwing Billy hard against the steel bulkhead. It was not a plasma strike or an energy weapon. It was the brutal, archaic impact of physical collision. The lead flagship of the ragged refugee fleet had intentionally rammed the seeding vessel, firing heavy magnetic grapples that violently pierced the outer plating to force a hard dock. The emergency airlock cycled with a furious, high-pitched hiss, and the reinforced blast doors were forcefully pried apart. The figure who stepped through the swirling vapor was a walking testament to stubborn, agonizing survival. Commander Sarah Vance did not wear the pristine, gleaming uniform of a highly advanced spacefarer. She dragged herself forward on two crude, heavily rusted mechanical legs that whined and ground with every single agonizing step. Thick hydraulic fluid leaked from the exposed joints, staining the deck. The right side of her face was a mess of old burn scar tissue, housing a jagged, red-glowing artificial optic sensor that whirred as it desperately focused on Billy. She looked at his bleeding hand, his scarred face, and the chaotic wreckage of the bay. Her human eye wide with a mixture of horror and profound exhaustion. She limped heavily toward the main console, her voice carrying the rough, gravelly weight of a leader who had watched too many people die. She explained a truth so staggering it forced Billy to lean back against the vibrating launch rails. This massive, chaotic armada was not a military vanguard arriving to fight the entity. They had no heavy cannons, no advanced plasma torpedoes, and no tactical strike capabilities. "We are not an army," Sarah rasped, gripping the edge of the console with a battered cybernetic arm. "We are a meat shield." She revealed that buried deep within the heavily shielded central cores of those battered, duct-taped ships were millions of terrified extraterrestrial refugees. They were the last surviving remnants of the highly advanced, genetically flawless allied races Billy had researched. They were beings of immaculate beauty, completely devoid of disease, possessing perfect biological symmetry. And because of that very perfection, they were utterly defenseless against the cosmic reaper. They were the exact prize targets the swarm had been hunting across the galaxy for the last 200 years. The swarm possessed an absolute blind spot, a critical flaw in its cold, mathematical logic. It simply could not target the perfect alien species because the outer decks of the entire human fleet were intentionally packed with thousands upon thousands of human volunteers. The ragged outer hulls were radiating a massive, chaotic biological storm of human imperfection. The swarm scanners were completely overwhelmed by the erratic heartbeats, the unpredictable genetic mutations, the chronic illnesses, the sweat, the adrenaline, and the messy, continuous cellular decay of human aging. Humanity had willingly stepped into the dark void to become the ultimate protectors of the entire galaxy. They did not defend the stars with superior firepower or impenetrable energy shields. They defended their flawless allies by wrapping them in a thick, suffocating blanket of human ugliness. They weaponized their own vulnerability, using their frail, diseased, and stubbornly resilient bodies to create an impenetrable sensory fog that completely jammed the highly advanced targeting nets of the cosmic entity. The universe demanded static perfection, and humanity had boldly answered with a loud, defiant roar of biological trash. However, the grand, tragic sacrifice of the human race was crashing into a brutal wall of reality. Sarah slumped heavily against the terminal, the glowing red light of her artificial eye dimming as she delivered the final, devastating blow. The refugee fleet had completely burned out their warp drives, pushing their massive mass across the last 3 star systems. Their energy reserves were entirely depleted. They were running on fumes. Absolute zero power remained for another jump. And by broadcasting his massive, chaotic signal, Billy had unknowingly acted as a massive gravitational beacon, pulling the cosmic entity right on top of their fleeing caravan and cornering them in a dead zone of space. Outside the reinforced viewport, the terrifying reality of their situation materialized. The symmetry swarm had completely stopped its forward momentum. Millions of colossal, perfectly angled geometric shapes detached from the main body, rapidly expanding outward into the void. They moved with terrifying precision, linking together with beams of hard, crystalline light to form a gargantuan, inescapable geometric cage spanning millions of kilometers in every single direction. The trap was permanently sealed. There was absolutely nowhere left in the universe to run. Sarah bowed her head, the rusted hydraulics of her legs trembling under the heavy weight of inevitable extinction. But Billy did not fall to his knees. He did not succumb to the crushing despair of the absolute end. Instead, he looked at the massive, glowing monitors, showing the sheer, terrifying scale of the swarm. Then, he looked down at his own mutilated hand, wrapped in bloody rags. Finally, his eyes locked onto the massive containment module of the terraforming bay, which was now vibrating violently on the launch rails, glowing with the furious, unstable energy of billions of rapidly mutating, radiation-soaked spores. A slow, defiant smile spread across his scarred, asymmetrical face. It was not a smile of surrender. It was a radiant, beautiful expression of absolute, chaotic madness. He pointed his bandaged stump directly at the trembling biological bomb and looked Sarah straight in the eye. "Then we do not run anymore," Billy said, his voice steady and burning with fierce resolve. "Give me back my signal." The vast, geometric prison enclosing them began to hum with a terrifying, absolute frequency. From the absolute center of the symmetry swarm, a blinding, completely silent beam of pale light descended. It was not a destructive laser, but a wave of pure, absolute stasis, mathematically calculated to instantly freeze the entire refugee fleet and the Demeter into a state of eternal, flawless preservation. The pale light washed over the forward shields of the human dreadnought, turning the reinforced hull into translucent, unmoving crystal. Right at that exact, breathless fraction of a second, Billy Baxter slammed his bleeding, bandaged arm down onto the primary launch controls. The massive magnetic catapult of the Demeter roared to life, violently shaking the entire ship as it fired the overloaded, aggressively mutated atmospheric containment module straight up the launch rails. The colossal tank of boiling biomass shot out of the bay at a massive fraction of the speed of light, hurtling directly into the blinding center of the descending stasis beam. The resolution of the universe did not arrive with a fiery, concussive explosion. When the containment module violently shattered against the core of the swarm, it did not release plasma or nuclear fire. It cracked open like a rotten egg, unleashing trillions upon trillions of violently irradiated, hypermutated plant spores, chaotic fungi, and unstable microorganisms directly into the highly charged energy environment of the cosmic entity. The rich, pure energy matrix the swarm used to crystallize matter suddenly became the ultimate fertilizer for the most aggressive biological payload ever created. Before the very eyes of millions of terrified refugees, an impossibly massive, chaotic jungle erupted right in the middle of the freezing vacuum of space. It was a riot of illogical, violently vibrant colors. Thick, twisting vines of sickly purple and radiant green violently expanded, latching onto the pristine, flawless geometric pylons of the swarm. Giant, grotesque flowers bloomed into massive fleshy petals, then instantly rotted away into bubbling acidic sludge, only to immediately sprout again from their own violent decay. Mutant mold and aggressive bacterial colonies spawned, violently consumed each other, and died millions of times every single second. The rampant, screaming biology aggressively chewed through the hard light and perfect symmetry, completely corroding the flawless architecture of the cosmic machine. Deep within its unfathomable structure, the quantum brain of the symmetry swarm suffered a catastrophic logical collapse. Its ancient, cold algorithms desperately tried to analyze, classify, and permanently freeze this sudden, overwhelming ecosystem. But the life Billy had unleashed was fundamentally impossible to index. It was too incredibly messy, wildly distorted, and continuously changing at a hyper-accelerated rate. The sheer mathematical impossibility of indexing a billion different simultaneous mutations completely overloaded the core processors of the entity. The ultimate arbiter of perfection choked on a towering wave of biological garbage. The massive, towering geometric blocks of the enemy began to aggressively fracture. Giant fissures of blinding light tore through the monolithic structures as the cosmic machine violently ripped itself apart to sever the connection to the invasive biological rot. The vast stasis cage shattered into billions of harmless, violently jagged shards that aggressively reflected the wildly illogical, pulsating colors of the space jungle. The remaining, untainted segments of the swarm frantically reversed their trajectory, folding space and retreating completely out of human territory, desperately fleeing the terrifying infection known as life. Amidst the brilliant, fading ruins of the dying cosmic forest, Billy Baxter slumped heavily against the damaged tactical console. He closed his eyes and drew a long, incredibly difficult breath, the wet rasp of his deeply scarred lungs sounding louder than any victory cheer. Across the battered fleet, millions of living, breathing beings pressed their hands against the cold glass of their viewports, looking out into the glittering, messy void. In that breathtaking moment, they finally understood the absolute truth. In a cold, uncaring universe that desperately craved silent, static perfection, the most incredibly beautiful, profoundly powerful force in existence was the stubborn, messy desire to live, no matter how deeply flawed or heavily scarred that life might be. Thank you so very much for listening to today's story, my dear friends. I would love to know where in the world you are tuning in from, so please let me know down in the comments section. If you enjoyed this journey and found today's story captivating, please consider supporting our channel with just $1. You can easily do this by scanning the QR code on your screen right now, or by using the donation link provided in the video description and the pinned comment. Your generous support allows us to pay our incredibly hardworking staff, helping them feed their families and empowering us to continue creating even more amazing stories to serve you. Thank you again, and stay safe out there in the stars.